Hey, it's Dr. Spates here giving you a drill on research questions and hypotheses. We've been talking all last week about this question about what the difference is between a research question and a hypothesis, and I want to cover a few things to help you see the difference. Let's start with the research question. So when we're talking about research questions, we're talking about being able to ask a question about the variables in the study. So that means in your literature review that you've talked about certain concepts that you want to look at in a certain way. However, with the research question, it does not make a prediction. Again, with a research question, you're not making a prediction, but you're simply going to inquire about the variables that you want to look at. Another reason for using a research question is that it's used when there is not enough research on that topic to make a prediction or an educated guess, also known as a hypothesis. So a research question is something that allows you to investigate further into the relationship of certain variables or certain concepts without making a guess, without taking a hypothesis about it. Instead, you're asking more about that topic. So that's what makes a research question a research question. However, sometimes we have enough information or our literature review provides enough of an argument where we can go further than asking a question. In that case, we're going to make a hypothesis. A hypothesis makes a prediction about the variables in a research paper. So in this case, you're going to end with a claim and say that based on what you already know, you're going to predict that this will happen, or this is the relationship between the variables in its different forms. And so when there is enough research about a topic, you're able to make that educated prediction about what will happen with the variables. This allows you to look at relationships, influence, and also compare the differences between certain variables. And those are different forms of hypotheses, and we'll talk about that in another video. So again, a hypothesis allows us to use the body of research that we already have to further it by making a certain claim. When there's not enough research or there's not enough out there for us to make a claim or a prediction, we ask a research question. The variables that we use in whether we're using a hypothesis or a research question come in two forms. There are independent variables and dependent variables. The independent variable, also known as the IV, it's oftentimes used as its acronym, and it takes the form of a stimulus or the cause variable or the predictor variable. The independent variable is one that stands alone. So the concept or the variable that you're using is not waiting on another variable for it to change or act differently. An independent variable is its own. The exact opposite can be said for a dependent variable, oftentimes signaled as a DV. The dependent variable is exactly what it says. It is dependent on the effects of the independent variable. So the dependent variable will have results based on what the independent variable does to it. This is also sometimes known as the effect variable or the change variable because it relies on the independent variable to make any adjustments. Again, when asking a research question or making an educated guess or a hypothesis, there are two types of variables: independent variables and dependent variables. The independent variable stands alone. It is the predictive variable, where the dependent variable is the one that relies on the independent variable or is dependent on the independent variable. So the only way any changes can be made is by the effects of the independent variable. Take this next moment to go ahead and test your skills. I'm going to provide you with some sample research questions and hypotheses, And I want you to identify several things from them just to make sure we're on the same page. For this first drill, I want you to identify the following. I want you to identify the variables involved, or the concepts being used, and I want you to identify which one is the independent variable and which one is the dependent variable. Finally, I want you to answer the question, is this a research question or hypothesis? So once again, when the next slide shows, I want you to take a moment and identify the following: the variables involved, the independent variable, the dependent variable, and finally identify this as a research question or hypothesis. Drill number 1. To what extent does task interdependence affect the degree to which group members feel like they are working together? Drill 1. To what extent does task interdependence affect the degree to which group members feel like they are working together? Again, I want you to identify the following: the variables involved, the independent variable, the dependent variable, and answer, is this a research question or hypothesis? Take a moment. For drill number 1, here are the answers. When identifying the variables involved, they were task interdependence and togetherness. The variables for number 1 were task interdependence and togetherness. The independent variable was task interdependence, and the dependent variable was togetherness. That means that togetherness would be affected by task interdependence, and task interdependence would be able to affect change in togetherness. Task independence is the independent variable, and togetherness is the dependent variable. Finally, this is a research question. But how do we know this is a research question? Let's go back. The statement says, to what extent does the task interdependence affect the degree to which group members feel like they are working together? Notice that this statement ends with a question mark. That is your biggest clue for knowing that this is a research question. Hypotheses will not use a question mark. Instead, they will just end as a statement with a period. Research questions always use a question mark. That's the biggest clue. Let's move to our second drill. Again, I want you to identify the following: the variables involved, the independent variable, the dependent variable, and I want you to identify this statement as a research question or a hypothesis. This statement says, how do attitudes toward corporate volunteerism and corporate social responsibility affect employee satisfaction with the organization? How do attitudes toward corporate volunteerism and corporate social responsibility affect employee satisfaction with the organization? Take a moment. Here are the answers for drill 2. Number 1, attitudes toward corporate volunteerism and corporate social responsibility and satisfaction. The independent variable were attitudes toward corporate volunteerism or social responsibility, and the dependent variable was satisfaction. That means that the attitudes that employees have were able to affect the satisfaction with the organization. That's what makes each one the independent and the dependent variable. Finally, once again, this is a research question. How do we know? Because it ends with a question mark. Let's try another drill. This time I want you to, again, identify the variables involved, the independent and dependent variables, and identify this statement as a research question or a hypothesis. This statement says females will express more organizational satisfaction than males. Females will express more organizational satisfaction than males. Identify the variables involved. Identify the dependent and independent variables. And identify this statement as a research question or hypothesis. Here are the answers for drill 3. The variables were organizational satisfaction. The independent variable this time was a nominal variable, meaning a categorical variable, and that was sex. And the dependent variable this time was satisfaction in the organization. So let's go back for a moment. It says females will express more organizational satisfaction than males. In this case, we are comparing between females and males. That's sex. That's the independent variable, also a nominal variable because it is categorical. And in this case, the dependent variable is organizational satisfaction because it depends on the sex of the employee. Finally, is this a research question or hypothesis? This is a hypothesis. And let me tell you why. As you can see, our biggest clue is missing. There's no question mark at the end, but also it's a statement that is telling you the relationship or what's happening between the variables. This is a prediction. It's saying females will express more organizational satisfaction than males. That is the statement and correct phrasing for a hypothesis or prediction. Let's continue with another drill. Again, we're going to identify our 3 things, the variables involved, independent variable, the dependent variable, and identify this statement as a research question or a hypothesis. The statement for drill 4 says, supervisors are more likely than employees to be volunteers for organizational work in the community. Supervisors are more likely than employees to be volunteers for organizational work in the community. Identify our 3 things. Take a moment. Here are the answers for drill 4. Willingness to volunteer. Our independent, this time, our independent variable is job role. So in this case, because we're looking at a comparison between supervisors and volunteers, it depends on that job role. So that becomes an independent variable. Where the dependent variable is willingness to volunteer, because that's the variable that will change depending on the type of employee or the job role. Finally, again, this is a hypothesis.